Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Melissa Marchand. I'm Marla's Communications Director. And on behalf of Marla, today's panelists, and the entire Marla Duguran team, I'd like to thank you for taking part in today's webinar. We'd also like to thank our sponsors for helping bring this event to so many of you that I know are on the call today. So that is Sol Petroleum, Simpson Motors, Interamericana Trading Corporation, AmCham Barbados, and Eastern Caribbean and Capital Media. Thank you so much for making this possible. We do have a Q&A portion lined up today, and that's supposed to begin at approximately 11 a.m. Barbados time. That's 10 a.m. Eastern time in the States. So please submit your questions through the questions box, and if you prefer, you can also submit questions to my email at melissa@marladuguran.com. I've sent you all emails, so you can just reply to what I've sent with your questions. And so now it's time to kick off today's event, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to today's moderator, former central bank governor and former minister of finance of Trinidad and Tobago, our dear friend and much admired economist, Winston Duguran, is going to lead today's discussion. Winston, your mic is unmuted and you are on the broadcast. Have a wonderful debate.
Thank you very much, Melissa and my colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a rare opportunity, and I want to thank you so much and the organizers for having this particular issue, this pressing issue of fixing the Caribbean and Barbados on public discussion here today. It is a great honor and distinction to have with us such a group of individuals who have come together to share their analysis and their experience as we try to look at the issues of the recovery process in Barbados with a fresh perspective, using their own experience and their own analysis as we identify what are some of the policy choices facing the people of Barbados and, of course, the Caribbean, and indeed, what are the options that are likely to be able to help us fix this aspect of our economic situation. Apart from the broad issues that have been in the public space for some time, I want to just raise as an introductory comment some conceptual questions that have been in my mind as I begin to look once more at the fixing the Caribbean economy and the Barbados situation in particular, more as an offense to economic thinking in the area. And there are three questions that I would like to pose at this point. Firstly is, essentially, we are dealing with an issue that has been described by the analysts as a macroeconomic situation which may need to be fixed. I asked the question that we in the Caribbean and particularly in Barbados have been so versed in the aspects of macroeconomic management, has it lost its magic in this particular case? And the second question I will pose is, could policy changes really, whatever they may be, alter and affect the laws of gravity in economics? And therefore, whether or not the debate becomes somewhat constricted by the laws of gravity in economics. And the third question is whether or not the logic of our economic solutions could deny the political calculations of the day. Those are the three broad issues that I bring to the table in order to put this particular debate in a wider perspective, and also to allow some thinking with respect to how we approach this, not so much as a technical issue, not even as an issue of purely of economic solutions, but an issue that deals with the subject and the discipline of economics itself. In order to take us through this morning, we are very fortunate to have persons of exceptional merit. Persons who are passionate in what they do and who have had very complex challenges in their own careers to confront. And many of us have had some testing times in the discharge of that duty, including my own self. So therefore, we come here with a full understanding of the intricacies of the solutions, the politics, and the options for the region. Let me first of all introduce to you Dr. Delay Worrell, perhaps the region's most prolific author on economic matters, a practitioner in public economic management, and a highly respected and leading analyst on issues of fiscal, monetary, and growth strategies. Dr. Worrell has been a person who has come to be known as a person of candor. And over the years that I have known him, I have always appreciated that his candor and the way in which he explains the situation comes from the strength of a deep and robust analysis in his field in which he tries to explain. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Worrell, to this particular webinar here this morning.
Thank you so much.
Of course, the person who has been somewhat behind the entire exercise is Mala Dukaran. Now, a name very familiar to minds. And her father tells me that the Sanskrit is missing in my name. But Mala is one of the region's most noted and accomplished economists. I refer to her as a new economic star that is emerging, whose insights into the new future in economic analysis have won recognition beyond the borders. In our many conversations, I've always been impressed by Mala's tendency to have evidence-based analysis and her willingness to speak truth to power in her commentaries, something becoming rarer in our environment today. And then, of course, to be joining us, I understand he's on his way to so do, is Professor Yanis Varoufakis, who was then the Minister of Finance of Greece at a very important and period in which Greece shook the world and indeed Europe. He attracted global attention in his flamboyant quest to solve what I describe as on the brink issues of Greece. He grappled in deep political battles, face to face with the international system in a turbulent and rocky period when he became the Minister of Finance of Greece. His account of that period is in his book entitled Adults in the Room, which is a telling, provocative, and controversial publication. He had many insights into how to fix the Greece situation, and as a professor, he outlined without fear and favor what he thought were the solutions, and of course negotiated in very difficult period. In one of his many thoughts, he asserted that the triarcha, which in the case of Greece was the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And he said, and I quote, they cared more about forcing Athens to comply with its policy demands than about whether those policies will help Greece recovery. I raise these issues because there are so much similarities in terms of where we are in the Caribbean region. How will we recover in Barbados from the current dilemma, now on a fiscal cliff and into the valley of debt, with an urgent call to embrace the new model of human-centric economic progress? At the core of all these issues is the issue of confidence, confidence in civil society and confidence in the international players at work. One such player is the International Monetary Fund, who recently conducted an Article 4 mission to Barbados. And in its press release of November 22nd of 2017, they outlined what I describe, and I attributed to myself, some very vague and uncertain options, and shed very little light on a credible path forward. But nonetheless, the analysis remains very sound. So today, in that context, we are coming in a face-to-face debate and discussion between both Delay and Mala and Vanus, as he will join us later on to give us his perspective from someone way outside of the region, but one who has had a deep insight into the world and international aspect of it. As we try to shed some light on the questions, as Melissa has outlined, we will have the presentations and then we will have the questions and the commentary by the participants. Before I just pose 2 or 3 broad questions that might guide us in this particular exercise, I say that to the presenters that we welcome you putting together your questions, and hopefully we'll end each comment with a question mark so that we'll be able to focus on exactly what your concerns. So as I introduce this panel today, I want to broadly raise a number of issues that I know will be dealt with expertly by those or the panelists. Firstly, what are the Barbados challenges that are of immediate concern? Secondly, are there really clear policy choices that can emerge as you look ahead? Thirdly, who will bear the brunt of adjustment now and in the future? Fourthly, what will the adjustment look like with or without devaluation? Fifthly, does Barbados need an IMF program? Is it inevitable? And will it work today? Sixthly, how did other countries in similar circumstances find, in inverted commas, a solution? And finally, what is the current strategy in Barbados? And is it too late to change course? It is in that context, therefore, that I have great pleasure in inviting this very distinguished panelist to try and address these issues in the public sphere so that we can see if we can shed some light, some new options, and possibly some insights into fixing the Barbadian economy. So with that introduction, I have great pleasure now in asking Delay to make a presentation to us.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Marla and to the organizers for making this possible. The good news is that Barbados has a very competitive economy. Our tourist facilities attract discriminating visitors and investment from around the world. Our international financial and business services are very highly regarded. We produce world-renowned rum and other products and services that have gained markets in the Caribbean and beyond. And Barbados boasts world-class entrepreneurs in the cultural industries, in new technologies, in renewable energy, and in commercial and financial enterprises. On the basis of this comparative advantage, the Barbados economy should be growing by at least 3% per year. However, the bad news is that our government is overspending and it is failing to deliver public services efficiently. That has stifled the economy's growth and eroded the foreign reserves of the central bank. Government spending on current operations exceeds tax revenues by almost 20%. If a private company's expenses are higher than revenues, that company will go bankrupt. If a government overspends, the central bank runs out of foreign reserves. That is the situation that now threatens the Barbados Central Bank after almost a decade of overspending. The inefficiency of the public sector undermines the country's competitiveness and damages its international reputation. Our current storage crisis is only the latest example of this. In order to release the country's true growth potential, two things must be done. One, government expenditure must be cut sufficiently to eliminate the current account deficit. And secondly, fundamental structural reform must be undertaken to assure internationally competitive delivery of public services. I have proposed a 7-point strategy which addresses these two imperatives. The main elements are these: a public sector reform package to be implemented over 3 years to eliminate the government's operating deficit and to achieve measurable improvements in public sector productivity. As part of that package, job cuts of about 1,500 per year in the public sector over 3 years, with separation packages to be funded by seeking financial support from international financial institutions. Thirdly, a cut in subsidies to state-owned enterprises of 10% per year for 3 years. An aggressive program of divestment of carefully selected public assets. The temporary freezing of all public investments except those funded by foreign finance. The final approval and start of major works on all tourism projects that were to have started in 2017. And finally, undertaking negotiations with the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, and other official and international institutions for financial support for a 5-year program of structural adjustment, the centerpiece of which would be conditionalities on the implementation of a comprehensive program for public sector renewal. That is the recipe, the prescription that fits the what ails the Barbados economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Delay, for putting together that logical frame. I think one of the issues that have emerged from what you said is whether or not there are immediate measures or there are medium-term measures, and whether or not we need to solve the immediate measures in order to get into the medium-term range. So now I'll ask Marla to give us her perspective on how this problem should be addressed.
Thank you, Winston, and good morning to everybody on the webinar. And thanks, gentlemen, for joining us. I agree fundamentally with most of what Dalal has said. And from my perspective, you're right. There are immediate problems that have to be solved, and then there are longer-term problems. To me, the most immediate thing is the fact that the central bank has been supporting the government's fiscal spending for so long. In the last fiscal year, the central bank supported the government spending to the extent of almost 800 million Barbados dollars. Now, in this fiscal year, I'm not sure how it's going to turn out. But the thing is, we're in an election year. Typically, most governments don't spend less in an election year. They typically spend more. And I shudder to think that the government will ask the central bank for support at the level of 800 million, as they did in the last fiscal year, at that level or even more, because the fiscal deficit has averaged 7 to 8% of GDP in the post-crisis period. And that does not include arrears that we know have been incurred and we know are of macroeconomic significance. So I think the first and most immediate thing is that the government has to reduce their spending. So in that regard, I agree with Dalal. They have to reduce their spending. And from my perspective, they have to reduce it to the extent at least that the central bank is no longer called on to support their budget. Now, again, I'm not sure what that level is at right now, but last fiscal year, it was 800 million. And the three largest line items in the government's budget are wages and salaries, debt servicing, and transfers to public, the state-owned enterprises. And each of those account for over 700 million Barbados dollars each. Now, I know Dalal spoke about, in terms of wages, the wage bill, reducing headcount to the extent of 1,500 a year for 3 years. Now, there's legislation that says that the government can't unilaterally cut the wage bill. But the thing is, if you look at a retrenchment process versus a wage cut, retrenchment actually will cost more in the short term because, as Dalal mentioned, you have to pay severance, and he's suggesting that we have severance financed by an international organization in foreign currency, which means it's more borrowing for the government. I'm not so sure that that's a solution that's optimal. I think if we can get the special majority required in the legislature to allow for a wage cut, I would think that would be the wisest solution based on the fact that there aren't the attendant costs of severance associated with a wage cut as there is with retrenchment. The second thing, I agree with Dalal on divestment, because we can't continue to send 700 million a year to the state-owned enterprises. And finally, with respect to the interest costs, now, roughly half of the domestic central government debt is owned by the NIS and the central bank combined. The other half is owned mostly by the commercial banks, and insurance companies, pension funds, and so on. My suggestion would be, in order to cut the interest costs, again, debt servicing accounts for over 700 million a year, I would suggest that we have a domestic debt restructure that would put these domestic debt instruments on a longer tenor with lower interest rates. But the private sector, the commercial banks and the insurance companies are not going to agree to this unless they see that there is a credible reform agenda. So I would say we have this debt restructure that is then combined with specific targets and a specific reform agenda that the government puts forward, either unilaterally or in conjunction with the IMF. The IMF, I think, would be that much more of a credible program. But anyway, have a debt restructure that is combined with conditionalities and targets and a reform agenda to make it that much more credible and achievable. And that should bring down the interest cost. So those are the three reforms I would suggest are the most immediate to bring down the government spending, at least to the extent that the central bank is not required to support via printing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mala. You have introduced the political dimension as well as the economic options. And we are very fortunate that Yanis has now joined the call. And I say to you, Yanis, welcome. Welcome very much to the Caribbean, and welcome for your presence here today. I did introduce you before you joined the call. So I now ask Yanis, who has had experience in handling this situation on the world stage, to give us the benefit of his thoughts on his experience and as he addresses this issue in the Caribbean region. Yanis?
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me.
We hear you just fine. Thanks, Yanis, for joining us.
Very good, Marla. Thank you for having me.
Hi there.
Now, hello. For benefits of full disclosure, I'm not going to appear in front of you as an expert of the Barbados economy because I'm simply not. But and therefore, I shall confine my comments to two important areas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is no doubt that there is a need for adjustment, for fiscal and structural adjustment in Barbados, from what I've been hearing and from the few pieces of data that I have reviewed in preparation of this webinar. However, having said that, the current account and budget deficits that you're facing are not monstrous. Anything in the region of about 5%, which is what I believe is your current account deficit, and the government deficit of 6% is worrying, but at least, compared to the Greek situation 8 years ago, you're in a rather strong position. So it is important not to overcompensate. It is important not to adopt hook, line, and sinker, an aggressive structural adjustment program, IMF style, which may very well lead to the kind of recession which in the end undermines the purposes of such a structural adjustment process. The fiscal multipliers of the Barbados economy are unknown to me, but I very much doubt that they are known by the International Monetary Fund or even by your own analysts. Fiscal multipliers are notoriously difficult to compute, and yet their accurate computation is absolutely essential. I heard particular numbers being bandied about in terms of cuts, 10% cuts in public sector enterprises, a certain number of jobs to be culled. Now, of course, you need to come up with numbers of that sort. But unless you are quite certain in your mind as to what the fiscal multipliers are, and I very much doubt that we know, the danger of an overcorrection that will in the end suppress government revenues inordinately in comparison to the suppression of government expenditures, that danger is always there. You will allow me to say that if you do believe that Barbados requires a rather rapid correction, a rather rapid adjustment, because you have effectively a foreign exchange balance of payments looming crisis due to mounting deficits, and as you said at the beginning, a situation where Barbados is entering the valley of debt, which I like very much as a metaphor. If you believe that, I think that it is absolutely essential that you should deploy simultaneously and with some synchronicity all macroeconomic adjustment tools, not some of them. And you can see where I'm taking this train of thought. I think that debt restructure at the domestic level and a devaluation, a sensible devaluation, the purpose of which is to adjust competitiveness, but in a lump sum manner, not in a manner that creates a self-reinforcement mechanism which feeds through inflation into further devaluations, are tools that you must absolutely definitely employ. Do not make the mistake that we made here in Greece, or that Mexico made, or that Argentina made, of trying to preserve the peg while using austerity effectively in order to take the full blast of the adjustment. So yes, by all means, you need to improve the efficiency of your public enterprises to make sure that you deliver to the people of Barbados possibly better services and more services than what they have today at a lower cost. yes, by all means, you will be the judge of that, reduce the size of public sector employment, but combine this with a domestic debt restructure, as Marla said, and a sensible, mild, but significant devaluation, which is accompanied by maybe some kind of inflation targeting to ensure that it is a lump sum and not a self-feeding and self-reinforcing devaluation drive. And finally, allow me to bring to the discussion something which is a little bit of a pet project of mine, just generally around the world, what I call fiscal money. You need to be able to at once signal to international investors and people from Barbados that if they repatriate dollars into Barbados or bring dollars into Barbados, either for investment purposes or in order to have their money closer by, that they can do this by allowing for the for dollar accounts to be kept in Barbados banks. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously, make sure that investors in Barbados understand that whatever structural adjustment you do is not going to have a permanent depressive effect upon local aggregate demand. Make sure that your exchange rate is competitive and that it is set at a level that equilibrates your trade and capital flows. And on top of that, and this is the pet project that I was going to refer to before, my recommendation would be that you should use, that you should inaugurate, using your own tax office, a payment system only for citizens of Barbados, taxpayers of Barbados, using their tax file numbers, attaching accounts to them, so that they can make payments to one another using your tax system, in effect some kind of payments based on tax anticipation notes. This is a way of creating liquidity within your domestic economy, which is dollar denominated, but which is captured within your domestic economy, and it affects only those who are paying taxes in your country. So a very brief example. Suppose you want to reduce the wages of a particular set of workers. What you could do is to say that instead of simply cutting off 10% or 5% of your pay, that 5% is going to be paid to you in an account which is attached to the tax office and to your tax file number. And you are given a PIN number, so you can transfer any part of that to any other tax file number in the country. So effectively, you allow for liquidity to be created at the level of fiscal policy without there being any chance that this money escapes out of the circuits of your tax office and contributes to your balance of payments problem. We can talk about this for a very long time, but the idea of fiscal money is not new. It has been tried. For instance, Ecuador has created such a system with a significant degree of success as part of their attempt not to deflate the currency, as part of their attempt to maintain that country's dollarization. I'm not suggesting that you should keep the peg. I was arguing a moment ago in favor of a sensible, mild devaluation, but the possibility of a fiscal money or a fiscal payment system within Barbados reduces the amount of devaluation that you will need in order to regain equilibrium in your capital and trade flows. So I'm not going to take more of your time.
Yanis, thank you very much. I think you have brought some new light, new perspective I will, of course, ask Delay and Marla to respond to your very innovative proposal for fiscal money, which you have outlined in in some detail here today. But beyond that, you have been able to make another point, and I think I started by saying that has macroeconomic lost its magic? You're bringing back the magic into it by saying that let us have all the tools come together, the structural tools, the fiscal tools, as well as the immediate practical tools that are required in this context, no doubt, resulting from your very deep and complex experience in Greece. So I will just open the discussion of your comments. There are many other issues you have raised, and they will come one by one during this discussion this morning. Perhaps Delay could respond to some of the suggestions that you have made, as well as how does that fit into his own proposals.
Okay, I'm just going to make comments on the devaluation. The government of Barbados is not going to announce a currency devaluation. We have never seen that in the Caribbean, except for Trinidad, and Trinidad is a special case. Instead, what is going to happen is that the central bank is going to lose control of the exchange rate if the foreign exchange reserves run out. You can only control the price of fish if you have fish to sell. The central bank can only sustain the peg if it has adequate foreign exchange reserves. So the essential sort of the fundamental basis of the policy of the government of Barbados is to anchor the policies on the exchange rate. So the exchange rate is the anchor for the macroeconomic framework. And that is why it is essential to protect the foreign exchange reserves in order to ensure that you can maintain the anchor. Now, the anchor for small open economies doesn't have to be a fixed exchange rate, but you have to have an exchange rate that you are in charge of, whatever that exchange rate is, whether you have a peg or a floating exchange rate or some kind of in-between system. It is now established and accepted by all parties that the central bank, that the central bank has to manage that rate. If you are an economy that is as open as Barbados is, in order to manage that the rate, and this is a lesson that the East Asian countries learned in their crisis in the late 1990s. You have to maintain adequate levels of foreign exchange reserves. How do you do that? You make sure that you adjust fiscal policies so that there is not pressure on the foreign exchange market. So that in order to avoid a devaluation, government has to take swift, decisive measures to reduce expenditure sufficiently to eliminate the current account deficit. And it has to remove the things that are strangling economic growth. The final point I want to make on this is that the Barbados problem is not a problem of competitiveness. It is established. We have the report of the World Economic Forum, and we have the evidence of the performance of our leading export sectors. The Barbados economy is the most competitive of the economies that have been evaluated in the Caribbean. And as I said at the beginning of my statement, that is evidenced by the strength of our tourism arrivals, by the fact that there are investments that, there are a number of investments that, amounting to at least $1 billion of investments in hotels and related properties and so on. These things are ongoing. And the thing that is causing that is restricting investment, the thing that is impairing our competitiveness, is the inefficiency of the public sector. That is the problem.
Well, Delay,
May I come in
please.
and make one comment, because I also have to leave you, have another meeting. Look, you mentioned the lessons from the East Asian economies. Well, surely those lessons are precisely the opposite of those that you derived from that experience. If you go to South Korea and you talk to them about the policies that you proposed, which are a carbon copy of the standard IMF package, they will throw their arms up in the air in despair. And they will tell you that this is precisely the policies that you must not employ. Their experience, their grave error. Think of 1998 Korea, Thailand. What was the greatest error, which they regret profusely ever since? That they kept to the mantra of not accepting the possibility of a devaluation, that they kept to the peg. Keeping to the peg and trying to adjust the whole, to place the whole burden of adjustment on fiscal cuts, which is what you're proposing for Barbados now, is what brought Southeast Asia down. When you say that, when you're taking out of the conversation devaluation on the basis that the Barbados government is not going to do it, I think that just kills off the conversation. All right, sure. If the Barbados government, axiomatically, because of some kind of divine intuition, is never going to devalue the currency, then why are we having this conversation? You're quite right. If there's never going to be a devaluation, all you need to do is you need to crush your economy through austerity. So let us not turn our theorems into axioms. If the Barbados government wants to do this, I think that deserves the contempt of all economists around the world. Whether there should be a devaluation or not should not be a matter of dogma, that this is something we don't do, as if it is a question of bad manners. Finally, let me make the point. You said that the Barbados economy is competitive, and there's no doubt about that, and if only the public sector was cut, everything would have been fine. Well, I'm sorry, but any economy which is in persistent current account deficit is an uncompetitive economy. You say that investment is high. Well, it's clearly it's not high enough. Because if your economy was competitive enough, investment would be sufficiently high, and so that exports and output would also be sufficiently high, so that you wouldn't have a current account.
Thanks, Yanis. I agree. Sorry to cut you, Winston, and I just wanted to say, Yanis, I really appreciate you coming and giving this perspective of, devaluation versus no devaluation. I mean, to Winston's point earlier about economics defying the laws of gravity, I think if you double the money supply in the 17 months to November 2017, and the ratio of money supply to reserves is 10-1, how can you maintain, just arithmetically and by the laws of physics, how do you maintain a 2-to-1 exchange rate? That's what I have a challenge understanding myself.
My only comment is that I have actually written a technical paper, which is available to you on my website. It's entitled, let me see, I'm just checking it here. All right. A forecasting model for economic policy in Barbados. And there I have, the equations and the calculations which underpin. I have a 5-year forecast in the paper that I've written on the Barbados economy. And, there I have, used the structural features. I've incorporated the structural features of the Barbados economy. And doing that, I have done an actual analysis of the current situation. I have incorporated the current tax policies. I have made the adjustments according to the 7 points that I have eliminated. I have stated in my strategy, and I have shown how, under current circumstances, the adjustment would produce the results which are in my forecast. And I have a 5-year forecast to 2021, which shows how the adjustment process would work.
Well, I'm
So,
interested.
before you prejudge the situation, I would suggest that the economists among us should read that paper.
Well, thank you very much, Delai. I think one issue that has emerged so far in the debate is questioning whether the Barbadian economy is indeed competitive from the point of view of the figures in terms of the current account deficits that was raised by others.
Persistent current
Mala?
account. Yeah. No, it's persistent.
Yeah, but that is an error which I'm surprised that so many economists make. In fact, there was a recent paper that I saw where there's a reference, and I will send it to anyone who's interested. The reference where there was a reference to the Australian economy, and if you look at the figures which were cited in that paper, the Australian economy has run current account deficits for 2 decades without any problem. And the problem, so the issue is not the deficit. The issue is what causes the deficit. So if you are an economy which is attracting substantial capital, foreign direct investment on an ongoing basis, you are going to have a current account deficit because the overall balance of payments balances. If you're getting strong inflows of direct investment, then your current account is going to be negative.
Mala?
I mean, I understand where Jalal is coming from, but we have to remember that, again, you know, had we not expanded the money supply so significantly over the past, say, 3 to 4 years, I mean, I could understand.
You know, you are, I mean, that is my fundamental point, right? That is my fundamental point. The problem is the money expansion, and what caused the expansion in the money is the persistent current account deficit of the fiscal current account. That's what caused. Exactly. Yeah. So once the government writes checks, then the only option the central bank has is to honor those checks or to cause an immediate crisis of confidence in the government.
One of the issues is the issue of competitiveness. And I have argued that countries have run current account deficits and fiscal deficits, and it is not an indicator of their competitiveness.
Absolutely.
I would like to get Mala's point of view, because I think Yanis has questioned that particular argument from the point of view of the theory of competitiveness.
Now, Dalal was referring to the Tourism Competitiveness Index, but I want to draw reference as well to the IMF's Week on the Beach Index. I'm not so sure if you all are familiar. The former IMF mission chief to Barbados, Nicole Laframboise, she spearheaded the calculation of this. It's something like the Big Mac Index, kind of comparing what the cost of a vacation in different tourism destinations looks like. And Barbados was one of those that was, you know, in terms of the competitiveness, price competitiveness, was one of the most expensive destinations. And we know that Barbados is a higher cost destination. Just last week I was there, and for 2 nights at the Hilton, you know, the cost was $1,000 US. But again, the evidence of the current account deficit and the balance of payments, I think, is part of the story that sort of debunks, you know, the competitiveness.
But Marla, if I may interrupt you there, competitiveness is not about price.
No,
competitive
I
value for
agree. I
money.
know it's value for money, right?
Exactly. So
That's
in
what can.
fact, the most competitive producer is the one who sells at a high price and still maintains or improves market share.
Market
And
share,
that is
right.
what Barbados is doing.
But we have
Okay,
not been seeing
could
the
we move
inflows
on
on
from
the
the
foreign exchange.
competitiveness
Yes,
argument to a question that came to us
yes.
through the system? And since Yanis may or may not leave, I'm not too sure. He said he may have to leave. What really is the concept of the fiscal multipliers that you referred to, and to what extent that measurement is done in Barbados, and what are the implications of it? A question from the audience.
Well, actually, the IDB did some work on this a couple of years ago and calculated all the fiscal multipliers in the region to be below 1, even the long-term fiscal multipliers. And strangely enough, for Barbados and Guyana, they found that the medium-term fiscal multipliers were negative. Now, it's kind of hard to grapple with the idea of a negative fiscal multiplier, but the reason for that was the fact that, first of all, debt to GDP is around, gross public sector debt to GDP is around 160%. So, and we know that in the Caribbean, we have this threshold of about 56%. Once we cross that, each additional dollar of debt actually has a negative impact on GDP. So that's one of the reasons. But we have very high fiscal leakage in this region, and Barbados is no exception. I mean, 80 to 90% of what we consume is imported. So, which means if every dollar that the government spends, 90 cents is flowing out to fund imports. So, fiscal multipliers are very, very low, if not negative, according to that IDB paper of a couple of years ago. So, just going to show that as we ramp up fiscal spending, which has been the case, I mean, 7 to 8% of GDP is the fiscal deficit in the post-crisis period. It just reinforces the point that this is why we've had low growth and why we've had the problems we've had on the balance of payments and with reserves.
Okay, thank you very much, Mala. I'm getting a number of questions that are coming from the audience, both those who are in and maybe out. So I don't want to leave them out. One of the questions that come up is, what do we really mean by a mild devaluation? I wonder if any of the panelists, and in particular,
Is Yanis still on the call?
Is Yanis still there?
No, I'm sorry. Yanis had to drop off the call.
Okay.
Oh, well, I'm so sorry because
can I say something on the fiscal multipliers? Because I have actually calculated the fiscal multiplier for Barbados in the technical paper that I mentioned. I had to do that in order to estimate the correction on the current account deficit that would result from the reduction in government expenditure and the correction of the fiscal situation. So there is actually an implicit fiscal multiplier calculated in that paper. So we don't have to guess what it is.
Okay, well, these are some technical issues that will bear on the solutions. If we could try and focus on the time on some of the ideas that have come out so far, I think it is general consensus. Before I get Mala to come in, because there's a specific question here.
I was just wondering if we could ask Jalal to share with us what that fiscal multiplier is.
Well, I don't want to get into a seminar discussion. I want to get into a public discourse. So that's why I'm refraining from these technical discussions at this point. And that I can do that in due course. But I think the question that has come up here is really how would you adjust for 4,500 public sector workers to be unemployed? And is private sector growth expected to close that gap?
I think Delisle should respond to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. As I say, I really would encourage the economists among the audience to read that technical paper. because
Well, you know,
first of all,
economists have got it wrong in the past, so I cannot rely on economists alone.
no, but
So
the people who
I
are
want to
asking
get the
those,
wider
right?
perspective.
Yeah. So basically, what I'm saying is that the underlying economy. Remember, I started off by saying that the underlying strength of the economy, right, based on our tourism, our international business, or the entrepreneurship that we are seeing developing in the renewable sector and so on. That underlying sort of impulse of the economy is at least 3% in real terms. What is happening is that the government inefficiency and the additional taxation that has been imposed in the last year is stifling that growth. So when you remove the NSRL, you immediately have an impulse of growth from that and the foreign exchange fee. So that is going to partly compensate for the first year's loss of the public sector employment. Secondly, you're going to have a productivity benefit gain because the private sector is, and again, I have that in my paper, the paper on economic prosperity. The private sector is more productive than the public sector. The third thing is that the public servants are not going home empty-handed, that they are going to be given, that there's going to be severance packages. That will mean that in the period of transition, and you will, it's going to be I'm saying that the thing has to be done in a modern way using best human resource technology. So you're going to have transition mechanisms, retraining, early retirement, and so on, so that there will be continuing spending impulses. Now, the funding part issue, which Marla raised, comes from negotiating a structural adjustment program with the IMF, with support from the other institutions. That funding is going to come in foreign exchange. Now, under normal circumstances, if there weren't a need for restructuring, those foreign reserves, the local currency counterpart, would be locked up in a blocked deposit of the government with the central bank. But because you
Okay,
need to restructure, you can use the local currency component to support the restructuring program.
the period of adjustment is going to require a lot of discipline and a lot of targeting and a lot of consequences in that targeting. And whether or not the period of transition will yield the results in the time frame that is required to have results is one of the fundamental issues that have emerged from that analysis. But essentially, I would like to get the two panelists' views on the issue of adjustment through cost or adjustment through prices. Because what I'm sensing in the division of opinion that have been expressed is one is let us adjust through cost by reducing cost. And to the extent we can raise revenue, perhaps. But the other one is let us adjust through prices, which is where the devaluation argument comes in. And fundamentally, the question is, are you relying only on an adjustment through cost, Delay? Or are you relying, Mala, on adjustment through pricing? Or you need to have a combination of both, which is really what Yanis was saying, that we need to come with a combination of them all together in a total package. And one final point before I ask anyone, the panelists, to respond is two shining, two positive lights is that the Barbados situation in a global context is not as bad as we tend to make it out to be. And that's a point that Yanis made out earlier on. And therefore, too drastic a measure may not necessarily be the right remedy. Mala.
So your last point there about how drastic the situation is, Winston, I mean, it depends on where you think, where your opinion lies as to how bad it is. I think if the central bank is financing 800 million of government spending in one fiscal year, it means the government is pretty much insolvent, and that to me is very, very severe in terms of where the situation is. Now, to address your question of whether we're looking at the fiscal adjustment versus exchange rate adjustment or both, I quite frankly think we need both. I think it is unfair to place the burden of adjustment mostly on public sector workers. And whilst everybody has to share the burden of adjustment, I believe that it is, well, for one, it incurs less debt than the option that Delisle put forward of laying off 4,500 people and borrowing to pay the severance. If you have just a wage cut, everybody gets to keep their jobs, but at a lower wage. So I feel that is the lesser of both evils. I think neither of them are comfortable solutions, but it's a necessity. But I also think that an adjustment on the exchange rate, especially given where reserves are now, we have reserves at 7 to 8 weeks of imports, well below the 12-week precautionary benchmark. I don't see how we can avoid it. And bringing foreign currency in by borrowing is not really an optimal solution. I also agree with Yanis that what we need to do is liberalize the foreign exchange system regime so that we can allow for foreign currency deposits. I would imagine there are lots of Bajan residents and investors that have foreign currency outside of Barbados. And if you combine the liberalization, allowing them to bring deposits onshore, which, by the way, the Bahamas just did. It's going to be effective Wednesday, I think, of this week, where for the first time in however long, Bahamian residents will be able to hold foreign currency deposits onshore. You know, you can if you combine these foreign exchange liberalization reforms with other reforms like public sector reforms, doing business reforms, and you have confidence and credibility in this restructure and the adjustment program, then it is possible that you can see foreign currency liquidity flow into Barbados and help alleviate the crisis and the constraints we're seeing on reserves. And therefore, the adjustment on the currency will not have to be so severe. But I quite think that we need both. We can't just rely strictly on fiscal adjustment.
Okay, and you have touched on the issue of fiscal money that Yanis raised earlier on as a mechanism to reduce the full impact of devaluation. The question that has come to mind here is what kind of measures are required to create broad political support for either of the options available to us or a combination of them?
Yes, Mr. I want to go back to the question of how big an adjustment, because I wrote about this in my economic letter of June last year, in which I cited examples of 4 countries, all of which are much, higher in the rankings of development than is Barbados, who in recent times, since 2008, have implemented programs of expenditure reduction, which were far in excess of what I am recommending for Barbados at this point in time. Those countries were Ireland, Iceland, Cyprus, and Latvia. And the 2 things that those countries had in common were that they took severe measures to reduce aggregate spending, as I say, far in excess of what Barbados is called upon. And secondly, that they did it with support from the IMF and other financial institutions. So that is why I say that in the scheme of things, what Barbados is called upon to do is not that difficult. What is more, that because those countries took decisive action and went to the IMF when they still had room to maneuver, the recovery was swift, and all of them are now growing acceptably. Most of them exited the IMF programs before they were completed. And the final point is that the exchange rate did not matter. Two of them are members of the euro area, and therefore exchange rate issues did not arise. Latvia is not a member of the euro area, but chose to maintain a fixed peg, and Iceland has a managed exchange rate. So the exchange rate is not the issue. And the final point I want to make is that we have to address the issue of public sector inefficiency. Barbados is a country in which the
I have
public sector.
questions that have come through the
Yeah,
public
let's
arena
first
right
ask,
now.
yeah.
So I was wondering if you could move on from that discussion into some other areas that have been raised here.
Yeah, let's do that.
And I think most of the questions that are coming through are dealing with, is it really sacrosanct not to deal with the exchange rate? And what is the reason for that? And even if you were to deal with that and you have an IMF program, the question that has been posed, how would you get acceptability for that program, whatever it may be?
Yeah, if I may respond to that, Winston, the thing is, when the IMF comes in to give you assistance after you've basically invited them to help you, they don't, and you all would both know this, having been negotiating on behalf of the government, they don't prescribe that you must devalue. But what they will say to you is, given these problems, you have these options, solutions available to you. If you take the devaluation off the table, then it leaves you with limited options. And as I've said before, it's a matter of picking your poison. Do you want to do it in a combination of fiscal as well as external, meaning currency measures, or do you want to go just strictly with a fiscal adjustment? And that's for the Barbados people and the authorities to decide.
While you're on that trend of thinking, would we expect massive inflation as a result of the expansion of the monetary base through printed and as a result of devaluation?
Well, it's one of those things that typically, if you have an open economy and you devalue and most of your imports are then therefore repriced, which we see happening in Trinidad, you see the pass-through effects of that into the final price of goods and services on the shelves. Now, if you look at the case of Jamaica, for example, Jamaica a few years ago, just as they were embarking on their IMF program, they saw their currency depreciate quite significantly. But because they implemented in a timely manner, very important pro-business reforms that made ease of doing business that much better. We have seen in the 3 to 4 year period, actually the Jamaican dollar is appreciating now, and that's a market determination of the Jamaican dollar. So yes, you will see inflation, but there are ways to control it. You have to control interest rates, you have to control money supply, and so on. But I think it is not a doomsday scenario that your inflation will automatically rise to the point where it erodes your external competitiveness automatically. I don't think that is a necessary outcome. I think once you plan it and you stagger or stage the reform process in a particular manner, similar to the way Jamaica had done it, you can actually reap some benefits. So I hope that answers the question there.
Well, let's go back to the areas that I seem to think that there is clear consensus, and there's a question that came from the audience. You talk about restructuring the internal debt with credible reform, but you did not say, or you may have said it was missed. What about the external debt? Is that a problem? Mala?
From my perspective, I don't think the external debt is really that much of a problem, because you have a few of them that are, have staggered maturities over a period of time, except perhaps the Credit Suisse one that we know can be quite draining, especially with reserves. Reserves are at a level of about 241 million as of November. But that's the reason I hadn't discussed the immediate need for external debt restructure is simply because the external debt burden is about a quarter of total public sector debt. So in my view, not the most immediate concern. Not to say that it won't be at some point, but I think in the more immediate concern is the domestic debt.
Okay.
On the domestic debt.
Yes.
Yeah, no, there's no need to restructure the domestic debt, because again, in my technical note, I show that once you fix the fiscal deficit, particularly on the current account, and therefore there's no further pressure for the government on the government's cash flow, that you can then use monetary policy to bring down the entire interest rate spectrum. You will also get a dividend from a credible program which is supported by the IMF, which will restore public confidence, both internally and externally. That is going to have multiple effects, including a reduction in the country risk premium as confidence returns and as your credit rating, the external sentiment about your credit rating turns around.
That takes time, though.
And hold on, let me finish. Let me finish. So what that enables you to do is to use your current monetary policy through your treasury bill intervention to bring down
the monetary policy. It's a monetary policy now being employed, not the correct one.
It is the correct one, but it doesn't work because government is chronically short of cash.
So how does it become correct if it does not work?
Exactly.
Because it becomes correct once the government no longer has a chronic shortage of cash.
But it has a chronic shortage of cash.
But it will not.
Cannot deny the condition.
It will not have a chronic shortage of cash if it implements the program, the strategy that I'm suggesting.
But there's a time frame and a transition.
No, but that is what I'm saying. That is what I've worked out in my technical note.
Yes,
so
yes.
I have looked at it sequentially from the last 10 years, where we were last year. What happens if we remove the NSRL and the foreign exchange fee? Then what do you need to do over these 3 years?
Okay, so
in order to bring things. So all of that is worked out.
Could I raise the issue of the contemporary economic climate in which the Barbadian economy is working? There appears to be a rebounding of the global economy, and there appears to be an increased investment in the tourism sector in the Caribbean. And given what we have said, would we expect in the next year or two a resumption of investment given the global climate in Barbados, with or without the changes in the current parameters? Mala?
I would say, Winston, that it's quite possible that we can see a resurgence of interest in Barbados if we fix the foreign exchange problem now, which is why I said we need liberalization of the foreign exchange regime. As it is now, foreign investors cannot get their dividends out in many cases because there is insufficient foreign currency to do so. So I think the first thing you need is...
So are you saying that there will be no positive impact of the global resurgence with existing exchange rate?
I'm saying there will be, but investors don't come into a country blindly and pour money in. They're going to talk to banks, they're going to talk to analysts, and when they find out that there's this shortage of foreign exchange, in terms of the reserve position being very weak, this is going to signal to them that when I pour foreign currency in, I am not too sure that even if I generate a profit in Barbados dollars, I'm not too sure that I'm going to be able to take my dividends back out in US dollars. That is a big concern, notwithstanding what is happening externally in the global and regional environment.
So there are two issues. One is the dollar accounts that you spoke about earlier on. And I think Anis also suggested as part of his fiscal money argument.
Yes.
And then there's the issue of the repatriation of dividends.
Exactly.
Is that an issue that has to be fixed now? Both of them?
As far as I am concerned and what I've seen and heard, yes, I think those are issues. And I think liberalization of the foreign exchange regime has to be part of the reform agenda. Otherwise, you will not get the kind of FDI that we need. I see Delilah's waiting to make a comment.
Is the word liberalization being used as a substitute for devaluation?
I certainly will not use it in that way. I think we need not just a devaluation. I think we also need a liberalization of the foreign exchange regime to allow for local for residents.
Mala, could you enlighten the audience? What's the distinction?
Well, a devaluation means that you change your currency's value in relation to its benchmark. So in other words, going from 2 to 1 to say 3 to 1, 4 to 1, whatever you decide you want to do. Liberalization of the foreign exchange regimes means removing the controls on foreign exchange. So in other words, the controls that exist on who purchases foreign currency, in what quantities, liberalization of the controls on who is allowed to hold foreign currency deposits, and so on. That's what I mean by liberalization. But I would suggest that we need both devaluation and liberalization of the foreign currency regime.
There's a question here. I believe
Winston.
Yes.
On the question of investment, there is at the moment about in excess of 500 million. In fact, it's probably closer to $1 billion US of investment in tourism and related projects, which are pending and are being held up by two things. One is the uncertainty about the government's commitment to correcting the fiscal balance, which is causing a lack of credibility and is causing uncertainty generally throughout the economy. And the second one is public sector inefficiency. There are people who want to invest in Barbados because of our inherent competitiveness, because they look all around the world and they look at all the factors which would facilitate their engagement with the international world of commerce. And they want to invest in Barbados, in the hotel industry, in the international business sector, and so on. But the problem is they cannot get the necessary permissions in a timely manner.
Okay, so you had indicated earlier that exchange rate policy must be one in which you must maintain control. The question that has come up here from the audience is that the country will not devalue unless the central bank lost control of the exchange rate. How can this happen? Is it through a black market? What does the central bank do if it happens?
Exactly. That is how the Jamaica dollar came to be devalued. If you go back to the history in the 1970s, in the mid 1970s, if you go back to in the case of Guyana as well. So that, and if you look at most countries, as I said, Trinidad is an exception because it is because of its oil, because most of its tax revenues come in foreign exchange, and that makes it quite special in terms of most.
The question is, how does the central bank deal with the black market in Barbados?
The central bank cannot. If you don't have, that's why I said, if you don't have fish to sell, you can't control the price of fish. If you don't have foreign reserves, then you have no control over the exchange rate.
So you
And that
maintain
is why,
control over the exchange rate, but you end up with a black market.
It's
no,
quite
you,
possible.
Is that what you're saying?
so,
I don't
you
know.
people
That's the
who
question.
need to import
Well,
things have to get their foreign exchange where they can get it. And if the central bank has no reserves to supply, and that is why, I have written about this on so many occasions, and nobody seems to be listening. You
Question.
manage in the open economy, you make sure that the central bank's reserves are protected by adjusting your fiscal policy so that you take enough out of the aggregate demand for imports so that there's always sufficient to supplement the foreign exchange reserves.
I mean, I
Uh,
want to just add to that, though, Winston. I mean, you double the money supply in 16, 17 months. You basically debase your own currency. So the question of a black market, I think, is just a matter of time. I mean, I'm not so sure. Luckily, Bajans are much more law-abiding than some of these other countries where we've had black markets. We have a thriving black market in Trinidad. But I quite believe that it's a matter of time if we continue with debasement of the currency by the rapid printing and reserves continuously going down. That's where we're heading. I mean, I don't see how else this is going to be resolved.
question. I'm here to convey the questions,
Mhm.
as provocative as they may appear.
Uh-huh.
Barbados is bankrupt. We need a receiver. Do you agree?
I think it's fair to say that the government is insolvent. I mean, the central bank had to finance the government to the extent of 800 million Barbados dollars in the last fiscal year. Who is the receiver? Now, the IMF is the obvious receiver, and that's the purpose of the IMF when you have a balance of payments or debt crisis. So I believe that it's really just a matter of when, not if, there has to be an IMF program.
Okay. I think a question that is in the minds of the audience, people and businesses are concerned about corruption and lack of confidence. I don't know if you could answer this question, but what should we do about that?
On the lack of confidence, I mean that's what my strategy is designed to address. That the lack of confidence arises, and here I'm 100% in agreement with Marla, arises from the fact of the government's overspending. The government's overspending means that the central bank creates money, that it puts pressure on the foreign reserves, that therefore undermines, creates a whole situation of terrible uncertainty. And in those circumstances, that is what you have to correct. That is the disease, and that is what you have to correct.
Well, sometimes, yes, go ahead, Mala.
I just wanted to add to that, that I think any government that comes out with a credible plan of adjustment, with or without an IMF program, and can deliver the results. I mean, and that's been the challenge with this government, that they've come out successive budgets and saying they're going to implement certain measures and reforms, and there is no execution. So I think it's not a matter of the government just communicating what kinds of reforms are necessary, but it's about execution. And also about, with respect to corruption, I mean, we know in Trinidad, it's a matter of holding people accountable, which we are not very good at doing here in Trinidad. If you look at what's happening in the Bahamas, I'm so proud of the government in the Bahamas already holding previous government officials accountable for alleged wrongdoing and misappropriation of funds. That's the kind of measures we need to restore confidence in the institutions that we have.
Okay, I think we are coming to the end of the time frame. So I will just try and raise a few of the questions that were sent to us here, that is in the people's mind, to get quick answers. We have been talking about a credible reform program, and that is the crux of the matter. The credible reform program will require public support, whatever it may be. The people of Barbados do not understand the depth of the problem. Question. The changes needed are huge. How do we get them to accept the medicine?
I think discussions like this help. I have done a short booklet which is available on my website, which describes how we got to this situation, and I think that there has to be ongoing public discussion.
Yep, I agree with Dalal. These kinds of discussions are important, but I think people have to want to know the truth. And many times it's human nature. Sometimes we want to hide our heads in the sand and not face the reality, because let's face it, the reality is a difficult one to face. But once they want the information is there, as to what the situation is and what the recovery is going to entail. And I'd be happy to help anybody who wants to understand that.
Well, at the beginning, I said political calculations are very important for implementing economic reform packages. To some extent, many of the questions that are coming here are linked to the question as to the politics of the reform program, with or without devaluation, with or without the IMF, with or without restructuring of the external and internal debt. These are the choices that are available to us. What is on the positive side is, notwithstanding what have we discussed here, in a broad context, the Barbadian economy remains broadly competitive, but it may not be competitive from the point of view of the balance of payments issues. What is also important here is that the world situation is improving. The Caribbean economies are looking a little more positively towards the immediate future, 2018 and 2019, and maybe beyond. So we would hope that there will be some investment, notwithstanding the problems. I do not that will be able to make the problem less severe in the minds of people. I think what is clearly coming out of this debate is that the situation in Barbados is not one of a basket case. It is one that requires careful clinical analysis of the policy measures, combination of them, sequencing of them, but we cannot at one time agree to set up a system to solve the problem tomorrow for today's problem. And in that sense, the transition period, the confidence issue are also important to handle in terms of the solution. So today, I think most of the questions have come in here. And there's one technical question. I don't know if we could get it answered, but it is an important question that came up. I thought earlier on in the discussion has to do with the question of the monetary base and the issue of the multipliers, the fiscal multipliers. What does that really have to do with the solutions that was raised here in the question? I don't know if you want to have a last word, each one of you, on where you see the situation moving forward.
Okay. You go ahead.
Yeah. As in the field of medicine, the prescription must fit the diagnosis. What ails the Barbados economy is a bloated public sector which the country cannot afford and which does not deliver many critical public services to acceptable levels of internationally comparable efficiency. I have offered a prescription to address these two ills, and as far as I am aware, it is the only one on offer. Thank you.
Thanks. I would just like to say that the burden of adjustment, I think, needs to be shared. Yes, we need an adjustment on the wage bill. We need an adjustment on the debt servicing costs and the transfer to state enterprises. But I believe we need an adjustment on the currency as well. And I think we also would benefit from a liberalization of the foreign exchange regime. And I think finally, one critical component that we need is we need a delivery unit. The CDB had an initiative with this basically PEMANDU, delivery units that can be implemented to execute. If you look at Jamaica and their EPOC, we need a unit that delivers and executes on the reforms that are articulated by the government, because clearly we have a problem with execution right now, and none of the reforms we're talking about are going to be effected if we do not have a proper delivery structure.
Last question, and I'd like to get 1 minute responses. Is it too late to introduce new measures and change course?
I would say no, it's not too late at all. I mean, when Jamaica embarked on its IMF program, it was, I would say their macro statistics looked with.
I agree. You know, my 7-point strategy is a strategy for correcting the situation from where we are right now.
Well, I think we've come to the end of this webinar, and I want to thank you all so much for adding so much different lights to it. There are more questions. I tried to cover as many as I could, but I'll pass the questions back to the organizers. They broadly speaking, the questions were raising technical as well as political issues in solving the problem. It's very clear to me that this problem of Barbados is solvable, doable, and can happen. And clear minds coming on the same table to discuss it in the way you have started here today is a step in that direction. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thanks to everyone on the call. Much appreciated.
Thank you.